Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Today, we're diving into one of history's most extraordinary stories, a tale that begins in smoky rooms and ends on blood-soaked beaches, where the fate of the free world hung by a thread. This is the story of D-Day, but not the version you might think you know. This is about the gathering storm that nearly never broke, the desperate gamble that almost failed, and the shadow war that saved democracy itself. Picture Europe in 1943. The continent lies trapped under Hitler's iron fist like a vast prison. From the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, the swastika flies over 400 million people. In London, the lights stay dim even in daylight. Rationing has turned meals into mathematics. Children, who should be playing in parks instead, practice ducking into bomb shelters. But here's what's really happening behind the scenes. In heavily guarded rooms across London and Washington, three of the most powerful men on Earth are planning the impossible. Winston Churchill paces the underground war rooms beneath Whitehall, cigar smoke curling around maps of Europe. At 69, the British Prime Minister carries ghosts on his shoulders. Every strategic decision echoes with memories of Gallipoli, Oleyemo, his catastrophic World War I operation that killed over 100,000 Allied soldiers. That disaster nearly ended his career 28 years earlier. Now, as he stares at plans for another massive amphibious assault, those ghosts whisper warnings. The whole of this difficult question only arises if we are to do our utmost to get ashore and stay ashore, Churchill writes to his chiefs of staff. But beneath his bulldog rhetoric lies genuine terror. Britain has already lost an empire defending democracy. Another Gallipoli could lose the war entirely. 3,000 miles away, Franklin Roosevelt sits in his wheelchair in the Oval Office, studying the same maps. Polio may have taken his legs, but it sharpened his will to an iron edge. The president knows what Churchill cannot say aloud. Britain is bleeding to death. Every month of delay means more merchant ships sunk, more cities bombed, more young men who will never come home. America has the manpower and industrial might, but Britain has the knowledge and the staging ground. Neither can succeed alone. Roosevelt pushes for action with quiet intensity. In his fireside chats, he speaks of liberation. In private cables, he calculates catastrophe. American mothers have entrusted him with their sons. British mothers have already sacrificed theirs. The weight of that trust shows in every photograph. The president ages years in months. But it's the third man who applies the real pressure. 3,000 miles east of Washington, 7,000 miles from London, Joseph Stalin sits in the Kremlin reading casualty reports that would break most men's minds. The Soviet Union has already lost 20 million people, a number so vast it defies human comprehension. That's roughly the entire population of New York State, wiped from existence. Every day, Stalin's telegrams to Churchill and Roosevelt grow more urgent, more demanding. When will you open the second front? The question hangs over every meeting, every decision, every sleepless night. Stalin knows, DHE, and his allies know, that without Western action, the Soviet Union might collapse. If it does, Hitler controls everything from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Here's the fascinating part about how these three unlikely partners actually worked together. Churchill, the aristocratic bulldog who'd fought Bolsheviks in 1919. Roosevelt, the patrician Democrat who'd never fully trusted European powers. Stalin, the Georgian revolutionary who'd murdered millions of his own people. Under normal circumstances, these men would be natural enemies. But Hitler had given them something more powerful than ideology, a common threat that could destroy everything they held dear. Their solution emerged from desperation disguised as strategy. If they couldn't agree on post-war Europe, they could at least agree on destroying Nazi Germany. Operation Overlord, THR. The invasion of Nazi-occupied France, THR, became their answer. Not because it was the best plan, but because it was the only plan all three could accept. The man chosen to lead this impossible mission had never commanded troops in battle. Dwight David Eisenhower, a Kansas farm boy who'd spent World War I training recruits in Texas, suddenly found himself responsible for history's largest military operation. His selection revealed the operation's true nature. This wasn't just military strategy. It was international diplomacy with guns. Eisenhower understood something his more experienced rivals missed. Overlord would succeed or fail based on cooperation, not just combat. British generals who'd fought for 4 years had to work with American officers who'd never seen action. Royal Navy traditions had to mesh with United States Coast Guard innovations. Royal Air Force veterans had to coordinate with pilots who'd learned to fly over Kansas wheat fields. But here's what the official histories don't tell us. Eisenhower spent more time managing personalities than planning battles. His most dangerous enemies weren't German generals, they were Allied egos. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Britain's most famous commander, considered Americans military amateurs. General George Patton, America's most aggressive leader, thought the British had lost their fighting spirit. Eisenhower's genius lay not in tactical brilliance, but in making these prima donnas work together. While the Allies planned, their greatest enemy was building the most formidable defensive system in military history. Erwin Rommel, the desert fox who'd nearly conquered Egypt, now raced against time to turn Hitler's Atlantic Wall from propaganda into reality. Rommel understood what his superiors refused to see. Germany could not win a long war. The Reich's only hope lay in destroying the invasion at the waterline before Allied superiority in men and material could establish itself. Standing on the cliffs of Normandy, watching French workers lay mines under German supervision, Rommel calculated the mathematics of destruction. 20 million mines planted along 2,000 miles of coastline, 500,000 steel and concrete obstacles driven into tidal beaches, 88mm guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Rommel's plan was brutally simple. Turn every beach into a killing ground, every approach into a death trap. The Desert Fox brought to this task the same methodical brilliance that had nearly won North Africa, but time was his enemy. Every day brought reports of Allied preparations across the Channel. Every week revealed the massive scale of the gathering storm. Rommel needed years to complete his defences. He had months. Meanwhile, an extraordinary transformation was reshaping Britain itself. In 18 months, 300,000 American soldiers poured across the Atlantic, enough people to fill a city the size of Cincinnati. They brought with them a military-industrial revolution that changed everything. Sleepy English villages suddenly thundered with tank engines and aircraft motors. Ancient manor houses became command centres bristling with radio antennas. Quiet country lanes carried convoys that stretched beyond the horizon. The entire southern half of England became one vast military base, Trio 2000, the largest concentration of fighting power in human history. The human stories behind these numbers reveal the operation's true scale. Mary Roberts, a 22-year-old from Dorset, watched American paratroopers practice jumps in the fields where her grandfather had grown wheat. She served them tea and listened to boys from Iowa and Alabama talk about French girls they'd never met and beaches they'd never seen. Years later, she'd remember their faces more clearly than their names. Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from San Antonio found himself billeted with the Weatherby family in Sussex. 60-year-old Arthur Weatherby had lost his son over Berlin 6 months earlier. His wife, Ellen, hadn't spoken much since the telegram arrived. But somehow, young Rodriguez's presence began to heal something. Ellen started cooking again. Arthur shared stories about the First War. Rodriguez wrote home, "These people have been through hell, but they're still fighting. Makes me proud to be here." But here's what's really remarkable about this gathering storm, the absolute secrecy that surrounded it. 3 million people were preparing for the largest invasion in history, yet German intelligence learned almost nothing useful. How do you hide 300,000 Americans? How do you disguise 6,900 ships? How do you mask the movement of 17,000 vehicles? The answer lay in a deception so complete it bordered on magic. Every real preparation was hidden within a false one. Real camps were built to look like fake ones. Actual supply dumps were disguised as movie sets. Genuine radio traffic was buried within fabricated communications. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, they just couldn't tell reality from illusion. By spring of 1944, the English Channel had become a steel-grey lake filled with ships, destroyers and cruisers that had fought from Norway to North Africa, transport vessels converted from passenger liners, landing craft built in American shipyards and assembled in British harbours. The greatest armada in naval history lay at anchor, waiting for weather, waiting for orders, waiting for history. The commanders felt the weight of what they'd created. In his private moments, Eisenhower scribbled notes to himself, "The hopes and fears of free men march with us." Churchill walked the beaches where Roman legions had once landed, wondering if he was planning liberation or orchest. Stalin, reading intelligence reports in the Kremlin, calculated whether his allies would finally act or find new excuses for delay. But perhaps the most revealing glimpse into their minds comes from their personal letters. Eisenhower wrote to his wife, Mamie, "Everything we've worked for comes down to the next few weeks. I pray we're worthy of the trust placed in us." Churchill cabled Roosevelt, "The tyrant's grip upon Europe grows stronger with each passing day. We must strike while we still can." Even Stalin, typically secretive, wrote to his daughter, "The fascist beast cornered is most dangerous, but cornered beasts can also be destroyed." By May 1944, the die was cast. Weather reports filled with anxiety. Intelligence summaries painted German strength and weakness in equal measure. Training exercises revealed both Allied capability and confusion. Everything was ready, nothing was certain. The greatest military operation in human history balanced on a knife's edge. Success meant the beginning of the end for Nazi tyranny. Failure could mean democracy's darkest hour. Somewhere between those possibilities lay the truth that would reshape the world. In smoky rooms from London to Washington to Moscow, 3 men had planned the impossible. On beaches from Utah to Sword, that plan would meet the reality of war. Between the planning and the reality lay 36 hours that would determine whether freedom survived or perished. The gathering storm was complete. All that remained was to see whether it would break over Europe like liberation, or shatter against Hitler's Atlantic Wall like the dreams of free men everywhere. The countdown had begun. June 4th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. In a wind-swept tent on the southern coast of the Reverments, England, one man holds the fate of the free world in his trembling hands. Group Captain James Martin Stagg, chief meteorologist for Operation Overlord, stares at a weather report that has just arrived from a lone observation ship battling through Atlantic storms. His eyes are bloodshot from sleepless nights. His uniform is wrinkled from hours hunched over charts and barometric readings. In his hands lies a single sheet of paper that will determine whether democracy lives or dies. Here's what's really happening in this moment. The worst June weather in 20 years has turned the English Channel into a cauldron of 30-foot waves and 60-mile-per-hour winds. The invasion, scheduled for June 5th, seems impossible. Paratroopers can't jump in these conditions. Landing craft will be swamped. Naval bombardment will be useless. Everything the Allies have planned, everything they've built, everything they've sacrificed, all of it depends on weather that simply isn't cooperating. But Stagg's report contains something extraordinary. A brief break in the storm. 36 hours of marginally acceptable conditions beginning the evening of June 5th. Not good weather. Acceptable weather. The difference between certain disaster and possible catastrophe. At 5 a.m., Eisenhower calls his final weather conference. The tent falls silent as Stagg presents his forecast. Winds dropping to 25 miles per hour. Cloud ceiling rising to 3,000 feet, seas reducing to 4-foot swells. It's not what they wanted, but it might be enough. The generals weigh impossible odds. Montgomery, usually confident to the point of arrogance, looks genuinely worried. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, responsible for getting the fleet across safely, shakes his head at the wave heights. Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory calculates how many transport planes will crash in the crosswinds. Everyone knows this isn't ideal conditions. The question is, whether it's survivable conditions. Eisenhower absorbs their doubts, their fears, their calculations. Then he makes the loneliest decision in military history. "Okay, we'll go," he says quietly. 2 words that commit 3 million people to battle. But here's what makes this moment even more extraordinary. Eisenhower has already written 2 letters. One announces the invasion's success. The other takes full responsibility for its failure. Both sit in his jacket pocket as he gives the order that will make one of them history. Within hours, the greatest military machine ever assembled lurches into motion. Paratroopers board aircraft that will carry them into darkness. Sailors prepare ships for the most dangerous crossing in naval history. Soldiers check weapons they hope they'll live to fire. The die is cast. There's no turning back now. But let's follow what happens when 18,000 paratroopers climb into transport planes and head toward Nazi-occupied France. These aren't the elite soldiers of Hollywood movies. They're 19-year-old farm boys from Ohio, 20-year-old clerks from Chicago, 21-year-old mechanics from Detroit. Most have never been in combat. Half are airsick before they reach the channel. The plan calls for precision drops on specific targets. The reality becomes chaos scattered across 60 miles of French countryside. Fierce winds that Stagg's forecast couldn't predict slam into the transport formations. Anti-aircraft fire forces pilots to take evasive action. Cloud cover makes navigation impossible. Instead of concentrated forces seizing key objectives, small groups of terrified young men find themselves alone in a foreign country crawling with enemies. Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne discovers this chaos in the most dramatic way possible. His parachute catches on the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église, leaving him dangling 40 feet above the town square like a human flag. Below him, German soldiers are shooting his comrades as they land. Steele hangs motionless, playing dead, watching his friends die one by one. For 2 hours, Steele dangles there as the battle rages below. German bullets tear through his parachute. Blood from a wounded foot soaks his boot. He can hear enemy soldiers arguing about whether to cut him down or leave him as an example. Finally, just before dawn, advancing American troops reach the square and cut him free. Steele's ordeal becomes legend, but it also reveals how close the entire airborne operation came to complete failure. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, the man responsible for stopping the invasion sleeps peacefully in Germany. Erwin Rommel has returned home to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday. The Desert Fox, who understands better than any German the invasion's timing and tactics, is convinced the weather makes any landing impossible. His absence from Normandy will prove catastrophic for German defense. But Rommel isn't the only German caught off guard. At radar stations along the French coast, operators watch their screens fill with contacts. Thousands of aircraft and ships appear on their displays like a digital blizzard. The signatures are so massive, so overwhelming, that many assume their equipment has malfunctioned. Reports flow up the chain of command, but German officers refuse to believe them. No army could assemble such a force. No general would attack in such weather. The reports must be wrong. This is where German rigidity meets Allied flexibility with decisive results. German doctrine requires confirmation before action. Allied doctrine encourages initiative despite uncertainty. While German commanders wait for verification of the impossible reports, Allied soldiers are already fighting for their lives on French soil. At Hitler's headquarters in Bavaria, the Führer sleeps until noon, as is his custom. His staff knows better than to wake him without absolute certainty. But what constitutes certainty when facing the impossible? By the time Hitler wakes and German reserves receive orders to move, 12 hours have passed. 12 hours that might have made the difference between repelling and containing the invasion. As dawn breaks over Normandy, the true test begins. At Omaha Beach, German machine gunner Heinrich Severloh peers through his bunker's firing slit and sees something that stops his breath. The horizon, from one end to the other, is black with ships. Landing craft race toward shore like beetles across a pond. Transport vessels stretch beyond counting. Warships position themselves for bombardment. It's the most awesome display of military power one man has ever witnessed. Severloh, a 30-year-old clerk from Lower Saxony, has trained for this moment but never believed it would come. Now, as the first American soldiers wade through the surf toward his machine gun, he faces a choice that will haunt him forever. Follow orders and kill as many as possible, or surrender and betray his comrades. He chooses duty and begins firing. Over the next 10 hours, Sevelo will fire 12,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. His targets aren't soldiers, they're boys the same age as his younger brother, boys who cry for their mothers as they die in the surf, boys who advance through curtains of bullets with courage that defies comprehension. Sevelo fires until his hands bleed from the machine gun's vibration. He fires until his shoulder is bruised purple from the weapon's recoil. He fires until he runs out of ammunition and the beach falls silent except for the moaning of the wounded. Later, American soldiers will call him the Beast of Omaha. German propaganda will hail him as a hero. But Sevelo himself will spend the rest of his life trying to forget what he did on the morning when the world changed forever. His story reveals the human cost of grand strategies and noble causes. Real people shooting real bullets at other real people. All of them following orders that turned boys into killers and beaches into graveyards. Yet somehow, impossibly, the plan begins to work. Not because everything goes right, but because everything goes wrong in ways the Germans can't anticipate or counter. Scattered paratroopers, instead of seizing specific objectives, create chaos throughout the German rear. Confused reports from terrified garrison troops make German commanders think they're facing attacks everywhere and nowhere. At Utah Beach, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and 56 years old, becomes the only general to land with the first assault wave. When his troops drift a mile south of their intended target, Roosevelt makes an instant decision that saves the operation. "We'll start the war from here," he announces. Instead of trying to reach the planned beaches, they'll advance from where they are. This flexibility, this willingness to abandon the plan when reality demands it, becomes the invasion's salvation. By noon, 5 separate Allied forces cling to Norman soil. None are where they're supposed to be. None have achieved their objectives. None are connected to each other. But all are ashore, all are fighting, and all are expanding their foothold meter by bloody meter. The unstoppable force of Allied determination meets the immovable object of German defense, AIT, and somehow, inexplicably, the force proves stronger. The German response reveals both the strength and weakness of their system. Individual units fight with desperate courage and professional skill, but their commanders wait for orders from superiors, who wait for orders from leaders who refuse to believe what's happening. By the time German reserves begin moving toward Normandy, the moment for throwing the Allies back into the sea has passed. As night falls on June 6th, the invasion hangs by a thread. Allied casualties exceed 10,000 dead and wounded. Entire units have been decimated. Critical objectives remain in German hands. The beachheads are shallow, fragmented, and vulnerable to counterattack. One determined German assault could still turn triumph into catastrophe. But that assault never comes. Rommel, racing back from Germany, arrives too late to coordinate an immediate response. Hitler, finally awakened to reality, hesitates to commit his reserves without understanding the full scope of Allied intentions. German commanders, trained to follow orders rather than show initiative, wait for guidance that arrives too slowly to matter. In this confusion and delay, individual Allied soldiers make the difference. Sergeants who take command when their officers fall. Corporals who silence machine gun nests with grenades and courage. Private soldiers who advance when every instinct screams retreat. Their names fill no headlines, but their actions save the invasion. The 24 hours that followed Eisenhower's "Okay, we'll go" nearly ended in disaster a dozen times. Weather that grounded half the air support. Currents that carried landing craft miles off course. Obstacles that tore open, assault boats. Machine guns that turned beach approaches into killing fields. Communications that failed when most needed. Plans that collapsed under first contact with reality. Yet through it all, something remarkable happened. Democracy's greatest weakness, EC, its reliance on individual initiative rather than blind obedience, EC, became its greatest strength. When plans failed, soldiers improvised. When communications broke down, sergeants made decisions. When objectives proved impossible, tactics changed to match reality rather than orders. By dawn on June 7th, over 150,000 Allied soldiers stood on French soil, not where the planners intended, not in the formations the generals expected, not with the equipment the logistics officers had calculated, but there, alive, fighting, and advancing toward the heart of Hitler's empire. The gathering storm had broken. The 24 hours that nearly failed had somehow succeeded. But the real test lay ahead, in the hedgerows and villages of Normandy, where the fate of Europe would be decided one field at a time. Let's build the nightmare scenario piece by piece. Let's explore what happens when courage isn't quite enough, when weather breaks the wrong way, when single decisions cascade into catastrophe. This is the timeline where D-Day fails, not through cowardice or incompetence, but through the cruel mathematics of war, where margins of victory measure in minutes and meters. It starts at Omaha Beach, 6:30 a.m., June 6, 1944. But this time, everything that could go wrong does go wrong. The naval bombardment that was supposed to soften German defenses falls even shorter than it did in our timeline. Instead of missing most targets by hundreds of yards, it misses everything by half a mile. Captain Heinrich Severloh and his machine gunners sit in undamaged bunkers, ammunition belts full, weapons clean, fields of fire perfectly clear. They watch the American landing craft approach like mechanical ducks on a shooting gallery pond. The 29 amphibious tanks, those swimming Sherman tanks with canvas skirts and prayers for propulsion, all sink in the rough seas instead of just 27. Without any armor support, the first wave of American infantry hits the beach naked against machine guns, mortars, and 88mm cannon. It's not a battle, it's a massacre. By 7 a.m., General Omar Bradley stands on the bridge of the USS Augusta, watching through binoculars as bodies pile up on Omaha Beach like driftwood after a storm. Medics can't reach the wounded. Landing craft beach themselves on piles of corpses. The surf runs red for 50 yards out to sea. In our timeline, Bradley considered evacuating Omaha but decided to continue the assault. In this timeline, watching complete annihilation unfold before his eyes, he makes the only humane decision possible. Cease landing operations. Evacuate all personnel. This single decision, born of compassion but disastrous in consequence, cascades into catastrophe with mechanical precision. German reserves, held back in our timeline by Hitler's indecision and Rommel's absence, surge toward the sound of victory at Omaha. 71st Infantry Division, 21st Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, units. Units that historically arrived piecemeal over days now concentrate within hours. At Utah Beach, 4 miles to the west, American forces who successfully landed now find themselves isolated and flanked. General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the 56-year-old who famously said, "We'll start the war from here," watches German tanks appear on the cliffs above his beachhead. The math is simple and brutal. 3,000 Americans trapped between the sea and an entire German corps rolling south from Omaha's success. By noon, the disaster spreads beyond American beaches. The British at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches achieved their initial objectives in both timelines. But success becomes meaningless when your flanks collapse. German reserves, instead of being drawn west to counter the American threat, wheel east against British positions that suddenly stand alone against the entire German defensive system. The dominoes fall with terrifying speed. Sword Beach, closest to the German stronghold of Cayenne, faces immediate counterattack from panzer units that should be fighting Americans 50 miles away. Juno Beach finds itself cut off when German forces retake the coastal highway. Gold Beach holds its positions but watches Royal Navy destroyers offshore begin evacuating wounded rather than landing reinforcements. By 1800 hours, -6 p.m., on June 6th, Winston Churchill receives the most devastating military report in British history since the fall of Singapore. 3 beachheads evacuated, 2 more under siege. Total Allied casualties approaching 25,000 dead and wounded. Naval losses. including 2 destroyers and 7 landing ships. Air losses exceeding 100 aircraft. The greatest military operation in history collapsing into the greatest military disaster. But here's where the real catastrophe begins, not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the capitals of the Allied powers. In Washington, President Roosevelt faces political disaster. American mothers trusted him with their sons, and he has fed them into German machine guns with nothing to show but casualty lists. Congress, which reluctantly supported European involvement, now demands withdrawal from what Senator Robert Taft calls Britain's imperial war fought with American blood. In London, Churchill confronts something worse than military defeat, the collapse of British morale. For 4 years, the British people endured bombing, rationing, and loss because their leaders promised eventual victory. D-Day was supposed to be the beginning of the end. Instead, it reveals that Nazi Germany remains unconquerable. From the smoking ruins of London's East End to the aircraft factories of Birmingham, a terrible question spreads. Have we been fighting a war we cannot win? In Moscow, Joseph Stalin faces the cruelest irony of all. For 2 years, he demanded a second front to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. Now that front has opened and failed catastrophically. German divisions that should be tied down in France are already boarding trains for the Eastern Front. The Red Army, bleeding white in its own desperate offensive operations, suddenly faces fresh German reinforcements just when Soviet reserves have been exhausted. Within 72 hours of D-Day's failure, Stalin makes the most pragmatic decision of his ruthless career. He opens secret peace negotiations with Hitler through Swedish intermediaries. Not surrender, the Soviet Union will never surrender, but accommodation. A separate peace that ends the Eastern Front War in exchange for German recognition of Soviet gains in Eastern Europe. The negotiations proceed with stunning speed. Hitler, facing renewed American isolation and British exhaustion, sees an opportunity to consolidate his empire. By July 4th, American Independence Day, with bitter irony, preliminary agreements are signed in Stockholm. Fighting continues, but both sides begin pulling back from offensive operations. The Eastern Front, which has consumed armies and nations, stabilizes along lines that will become permanent borders. This leaves the Western Allies facing a transformed war. Instead of a Germany fighting on 2 fronts, they now confront a Reich that can concentrate its full power against Anglo-American forces. Instead of Soviet pressure drawing German reserves eastward, those reserves flood westward to strengthen Atlantic defenses. Instead of coordinated Allied pressure from multiple directions, Hitler faces only the bombing campaign and whatever future invasion attempts Britain and America can mount. The mathematics of this new war are terrifying. Germany, freed from Eastern Front losses, can maintain 150 divisions in Western Europe instead of 50. The Atlantic Wall, instead of being stripped to reinforce Russia, receives unlimited resources and manpower. Jet aircraft production, no longer competing with Eastern Front tank requirements, accelerates dramatically. V-2 rocket attacks on London, historically limited by resource shortages, intensify into round-the-clock bombardment. By autumn 1944, Britain stands alone again, not as in 1940 when facing a Germany distracted by Eastern ambitions, but against a Reich that can focus its entire industrial and military might on destroying British resistance. American support continues, but domestic pressure forces Roosevelt to prioritize the Pacific War against Japan. The European commitment, tainted by D-Day's failure, becomes politically unsustainable. The Christmas 1944 aerial blitz of London exceeds even the worst nights of 1940. V-2 rockets fall like mechanical hail. Jet fighters sweep British skies with impunity. German paratroopers, no longer needed to guard against Soviet offensives, concentrate in France for Operation Sea Lion, Ratage Deer, the invasion of Britain that was postponed, not cancelled. But the Western Allies possess one weapon that changes everything: the atomic bomb. In our timeline, nuclear weapons ended the Pacific War in August 1945. In this timeline, with Nazi Germany intact and Britain facing invasion, different decisions become necessary. President Harry Truman, IAA, Roosevelt died of exhaustion and stress in March 1945. 25. Faces the most terrible choice in human history. November 20th, 1945. A modified B-29 bomber, launching from a base in Scotland, flies toward Berlin carrying humanity's newest and most destructive weapon. German jet fighters rise to intercept, but the bomber's altitude and speed carry it through. At 11:47 a.m. Central European Time, atomic fire blooms over the Reich Chancellery. The explosion vaporizes central Berlin and Adolf Hitler with it. But unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this atomic attack does not end a war, it transforms one. Heinrich Himmler, assuming leadership from his headquarters in Bavaria, orders immediate retaliation. Not with atomic weapons, Emini lacks them, but with everything else in the Nazi arsenal. Chemical weapons, banned since World War I, rain down on London. Biological agents, developed in secret laboratories, spread plague across Allied supply lines. V-2 rockets, now carrying poison gas warheads, turn every impact into a toxic zone. The war, Hitler began with conventional invasion, ends with apocalyptic escalation. By Christmas 1945, Europe lies poisoned and burning. Britain survives behind gas masks and chemical suits. Germany rules a radioactive wasteland. France serves as a contaminated no man's land where nothing lives. The liberation that should have begun on the beaches of Normandy instead unleashes weapons that make the continent uninhabitable. The final peace, signed in neutral Switzerland in March 1946, divides Europe along lines of mutual exhaustion. The Rhine River becomes the permanent border between a British-American alliance, controlling Western Europe's ruins, and a German Reich holding the devastated East. The Soviet Union, having avoided atomic attack through its separate peace, emerges as the only intact European power. This nightmare timeline's consequences echo through decades. The Cold War begins not between America and Russia, but between Anglo-American and German Soviet blocs, separated by hundreds of miles of radioactive wasteland. European recovery becomes impossible when entire regions remain uninhabitable. Nuclear proliferation accelerates, as every nation seeks weapons to prevent its own atomic destruction. Most tragically, the Holocaust continues. Without Allied liberation, concentration camps operate until 1948, when German collapse finally ends systematic murder. 6 million Jewish deaths become 8 million. Roma, disabled persons, political prisoners, Reich, all suffer extended persecution in a Reich that survives 3 years longer than historically possible. Democracy itself bears permanent scars. American voters, traumatized by D-Day's failure and nuclear escalation, retreat into isolationism that lasts decades. British society, poisoned literally and figuratively by chemical warfare, never recovers its confidence. The ideals that motivated resistance to fascism, ABA, freedom, human dignity, international cooperation, ABA, seem naive in a world where atomic weapons answer political disagreements. Standing in this alternative present, we see how close our world came to unimaginable catastrophe. D-Day succeeded by margins measured in individual decisions, weather breaks lasting hours, and courage, sustained for minutes. Change any of those factors, make Vsevolozh's ammunition last longer, delay Eisenhower's weather window by 2 days, place Rommel at his headquarters instead of Germany, AI, and freedom's survival becomes questionable. The beach at Omaha, where we know tourists walk safely today, could easily have become a monument to democracy's failure rather than its triumph. The difference between liberation and catastrophe measured not in grand strategies or national resources, but in the space between one young soldier's step forward and his step back when machine guns opened fire. This is why we remember D-Day not as inevitable victory, but as impossible success. Because when we understand how easily it could have failed, we better appreciate how miraculous it was that it succeeded. And perhaps more importantly, we understand that freedom's survival is never guaranteed. It depends on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. When history demands courage over comfort, action over safety, hope over fear. The nightmare timeline reminds us that the world we inherited was not inevitable. It was chosen, one decision at a time, by people who refused to let darkness win. Behind the chaos of D-Day's beaches, invisible warriors fought a battle just as crucial as any tank engagement or artillery duel. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, they were spies, codebreakers, resistance fighters, and confidence artists, whose weapons were deception, intelligence, and pure nerve. Their stories remained classified for decades, but without their shadow war, the landings would have failed before the first boat touched French sand. Meet Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish chicken farmer who hated fascism so much he invented an entire army to fool Adolf Hitler. Garcia's story reads like fiction, but every word is documented truth. In 1941, this unassuming man from Barcelona approached British intelligence with an audacious offer. He would become a German spy and feed them false information. The British, suspicious of unsolicited volunteers, rejected him. Undeterred, Garcia took his act directly to the Germans. Posing as a Spanish diplomat with anti-British sympathies, he convinced German intelligence to hire him as their primary spy in Britain. There was just one problem. Garcia had never been to Britain. Working from Lisbon with a tourist guidebook and his imagination, he began filing reports about his supposed network of British contacts. Here's what's absolutely remarkable. The Germans believed him completely. Garcia, codenamed Arabelle by German intelligence and Garbo by the British who eventually recruited him, created 27 fictional sub-agents across Britain. Each had detailed backgrounds, personal quirks, and believable motivations. Agent 3 was a Venezuelan student in Glasgow who hated the British class system. Agent 7 was a Welsh soldier stationed in Dover who needed money for his sick wife. Agent 4-3 was a guard at an ammunition depot who drank too much and talked too freely. None of them existed. All of them were Garcia, writing their reports from a rented room in London while consulting maps and train schedules to make his intelligence seem authentic. By 1944, German High Command considered Garcia their most valuable agent, Recon, the one source they trusted above all others for information about Allied intentions. On D-Day morning, Garcia sent his masterpiece, an urgent report stating that Normandy was merely a diversion. The real invasion, he insisted, would come at Pas de Calais in mid-July with an army group under General George Patton. To make this deception credible, Garcia had spent months building a fictional 1st United States Army group, complete with radio traffic, fake equipment, and dummy installations that German reconnaissance could photograph. The Germans believed Garcia so completely that Hitler held 19 divisions in reserve around Calais for 45 crucial days after D-Day. 45 days when those divisions could have thrown the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they waited for an invasion that existed only in one Spanish chicken farmer's imagination. But Garcia's deception worked only because another shadow warrior had solved the puzzle of German communications. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion converted into Britain's code-breaking centre, 24-year-old Joan Clarke bent over intercepts that would change history. Clarke, one of the few women allowed into Britain's most secret installation, possessed a mathematical mind that could see patterns where others saw randomness. On June 3, 1944, Clarke decoded a German message that revealed the exact positions of panzer reserves behind Utah and Omaha beaches. Without her work, Allied naval bombardment would have continued targeting empty fortifications while missing the real threats. Clarke's mathematics allowed Allied gunners to redirect their fire onto actual German positions, suppressing defences that would otherwise have slaughtered the first wave of landing craft. But here's what makes Clarke's contribution even more extraordinary. She had to fight for the right to make it. British intelligence initially restricted women to clerical roles, assuming they lacked the mental capacity for serious code breaking. Clarke proved them wrong by consistently solving puzzles that stumped her male colleagues. Her supervisor, recognizing her talent, quietly assigned her the most critical intercepts while officially crediting her work to male cryptographers. The truth remained classified for 30 years. When Clarke's role finally became public, historians realized that one young woman's mathematical genius had prevented a potential disaster at the waterline. The tanks that should have destroyed Allied landing craft instead fell silent under precisely targeted naval gunfire, all because Joan Clark could see patterns in seemingly random letters and numbers. While Clark fought her battles with mathematics, 16-year-old Janine Boitard fought hers with bicycles and backroads through occupied France. Boitard, a member of the French resistance cell operating around Caen, carried information that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe for British forces landing at Sword Beach. 3 days before D-Day, Boitard received maps showing new German minefields and artillery positions near the British landing zones. The information came from a French engineer forced to work on Atlantic Wall fortifications, a man who risked execution every time he passed intelligence to the resistance. Getting those maps to London meant carrying them past German checkpoints, through areas crawling with Wehrmacht patrols, over roads that could explode beneath her bicycle wheels at any moment. Boitard sewed the maps into her jacket lining and set out on a journey that should have taken 2 hours but lasted 8. Twice, German patrols stopped her. The first time, they searched her bicycle but not her clothing. The second time, an SS officer examined her identity papers while standing close enough to hear her heart pounding. Each time, she maintained the fiction that she was visiting her sick aunt in a nearby village. The maps reached London through an underground network that moved intelligence from French farms to British planning rooms in less than 48 hours. Allied commanders used Boitard's information to redirect naval bombardment away from empty positions toward actual German strongpoints. Without her courage and the accuracy of her intelligence, British forces at Sword Beach would have walked into killing fields that Allied planners never knew existed. But perhaps the most crucial shadow warrior was Stanisław Sosabowski, the Polish general whom Allied commanders ignored until it was almost too late. Sosabowski commanded the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade, elite troops who had trained for 3 years to fight alongside British forces. But more importantly, he possessed something most Allied planners lacked: recent experience fighting Germans in actual combat. Sosabowski had commanded Polish forces during the 1939 invasion, the Norwegian campaign, and the Battle of France. He understood German tactics, German psychology, and German weaknesses from ground-level experience. When Allied planners briefed him on D-Day operations, Sosabowski immediately identified problems that would prove prophetic. He warned that German anti-aircraft defenses were stronger than intelligence suggested. He predicted that scattered drops would leave airborne forces isolated and vulnerable. He insisted that German reserves would react faster than Allied estimates assumed. Most crucially, he argued that the invasion would succeed only if Allied forces moved inland quickly, before German commanders could coordinate effective counterattacks. Allied staff officers, particularly British professionals who resented Polish criticism of their plans, dismissed Sosabowski's warnings as continental pessimism. They had studied German capabilities from intelligence reports and aerial reconnaissance. He had fought Germans with rifle and bayonet. They thought their analysis was more objective. He knew their analysis was incomplete. D-Day proved Sosabowski correct on every point. Anti-aircraft fire scattered paratrooper formations exactly as he predicted. German reserves did react faster than Allied estimates suggested. Isolated airborne units did face near annihilation before ground forces could relieve them. The invasion succeeded precisely because individual Allied soldiers displayed the initiative and flexibility that Sosabowski had insisted would be necessary. But Sosabowski's greatest contribution came through his preparations rather than his predictions. Convinced that everything would go wrong, he trained his Polish paratroopers to operate independently in small groups, while British and American airborne units practiced seizing specific objectives. Polish forces learned to survive and fight effectively, regardless of where they landed or what they encountered. When the drops scattered Allied paratroopers across Normandy, Polish units adapted immediately. Instead of trying to reach predetermined objectives, they attacked whatever German positions they found. Instead of waiting for orders from scattered commanders, they acted on their own initiative to disrupt German communications and supply lines. Their flexibility, born from Sosabowski's insistence that plans always fail, multiplied the confusion that prevented effective German response. These shadow warriors, Garcia with his fictional army, Clark with her mathematical genius, Boitard with her bicycle and courage, Sosabowski with his bitter experience, wove a web of deception and intelligence that made D-Day possible. They fought not with tanks and artillery, but with imagination and determination, turning German strengths into Allied advantages through pure intellectual warfare. But their success depended on one more factor that historians often overlook: the network of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. French telephone operators who accidentally disconnected German communications, Dutch fishermen who reported German ship movements to London, Belgian railway workers who sabotaged train schedules carrying German reinforcements, Norwegian weather observers who transmitted Atlantic storm data despite facing execution if caught. Each of these acts seems small in isolation. A wrong number here, a delayed train there, a weather report that arrives 12 hours late. But together, they created the conditions that allowed the Shadow Warriors' main operations to succeed. Garcia's deceptions worked because German communications were unreliable. Clark's intelligence was actionable because resistance networks could confirm and supplement her information. Boitard's maps were valuable because sabotage had forced Germans to constantly relocate their defenses. Most remarkably, these shadow warriors operated without knowing each other's roles or even existence. Garcia never knew that Clark was reading the German responses to his false intelligence. Clark never learned that French teenagers were risking their lives to confirm her mathematical calculations. Sosabowski never discovered that his warnings had inspired changes in Allied training that saved thousands of lives. They were connected only by shared purpose and mutual trust in people they would never meet. A Spanish chicken farmer trusted British intelligence officers to use his deceptions effectively. A British mathematician trusted French resistance fighters to provide accurate ground intelligence. A Polish general trusted Allied commanders to learn from their mistakes. A French teenager trusted London planners to act on intelligence she delivered at the risk of her life. This trust network, invisible and informal, proved stronger than any military organization chart. When formal communications failed, as they did repeatedly on D-Day, the Shadow Warriors' connections continued functioning. When official plans collapsed, as they did across Normandy, their alternative preparations filled the gaps. When conventional forces faced unexpected challenges, SAIS, as happened at every beach, their unconventional solutions provided answers. Looking back, we can see that D-Day succeeded because two wars were fought simultaneously. The visible war of soldiers and ships and aircraft that filled newspaper headlines, and the invisible war of spies and codebreakers and resistance fighters whose victories never made the news but made all other victories possible. The Shadow Warriors remind us that history's greatest achievements often depend on people whose names we never learn, whose contributions remain classified, whose courage goes unrecognized for decades. They chose to serve causes larger than themselves, to risk everything for freedoms they might not live to enjoy, to trust strangers with their lives and their nation's futures. When we walk the beaches of Normandy today, we see monuments to the soldiers who fought there, but we should also remember the invisible army that fought in code rooms and safe houses, in bicycle repair shops and radio stations, in the imagination of a Spanish farmer and the mathematical genius of a British woman. Their battlefield was the human mind, their weapons were truth and deception, and their victory made all other victories possible. The Shadow War of D-Day teaches us that freedom's defense requires not just courage but creativity, not just strength but intelligence, not just weapons but trust. In a world where information moves at the speed of light and deception spreads as quickly as truth, the Shadow Warriors' lessons remain more relevant than ever. The invasion of Normandy depended on technologies that barely existed months before D-Day, innovations so desperate and experimental that they bordered on science fiction. These weren't refined weapons systems perfected through years of development, too they were mechanical. Hail Marys, engineering prayers, and industrial miracles held together by ingenuity, desperation, and the kind of creative madness that emerges when failure means the end of civilization. Take the Mulberry Harbours, perhaps the most audacious engineering project in military history. Imagine building a port the size of Dover, making it float, then towing it across the English Channel in pieces. The concept seemed impossible even to the engineers tasked with creating it. How do you construct something massive enough to handle Liberty ships and strong enough to survive Atlantic storms, yet mobile enough to cross 60 miles of open water? The answer emerged from the brilliant mind of Winston Churchill himself, who scribbled the initial concept on a napkin during a dinner meeting. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. British engineers worked 20-hour days, creating concrete caissons, each weighing 6,000 tons, structures so massive they dwarfed office buildings. The first test of a prototype section took place in a Scottish loch, under conditions of absolute secrecy. Royal Navy officers, sworn to silence, watched the massive concrete structure slide into the water and immediately sink to the bottom like a stone. Complete failure. With only 8 weeks until invasion, the engineering team redesigned everything. New calculations, new materials, new construction techniques developed under pressure that would have broken peacetime projects. They created floating roadways that could flex with ocean swells, pierheads that could rise and fall with 18-foot tides, and breakwaters constructed from sunken ships filled with concrete. By June 6th, 2 complete harbours, ACE, codenamed Mulberry A and Mulberry B, were ready for towing across the Channel. Each harbour could handle more cargo than the Port of Liverpool. Each represented engineering innovation compressed into timelines that defied industrial logic. Each worked just well enough to make the impossible possible. But even more desperate than floating harbours were the swimming tanks, officially designated duplex drive Shermans, but known to their crews by unprintable nicknames. Picture a 33-ton Sherman tank equipped with a canvas flotation screen, twin propellers, and enough faith to cross the English Channel under its own power. The concept challenged every principle of naval architecture and common sense. The flotation system consisted of a collapsible canvas screen that raised the tank's waterline from 6 feet to 9 feet above the tracks. Twin propellers, powered by the tank's main engine through a complex transmission system, provided forward motion at the blazing speed of 4 knots in calm water. In 6-foot channel swells, the system became a death trap. At Omaha Beach, 29 DD tanks launched from landing craft 3 miles offshore. The canvas screens, designed for calm water testing, immediately began tearing in the rough seas. Water poured through gaps in the flotation collars. Tank commanders, sealed inside iron boxes riding barely above the waterline, could see nothing except canvas and spray. 27 tanks sank within minutes, taking their crews down in armoured coffins. Yet, at other beaches, the DD tanks worked just enough to provide crucial fire support. At Gold Beach, British tank crews managed to get 19 of 24 tanks ashore, where their 75mm guns silenced German strongpoints that could have massacred the infantry. At Juno Beach, Canadian tankers used DD Shermans to blast through seawalls that conventional explosives couldn't breach. The difference between success and failure, often measured in individual crew decisions made under impossible conditions. Tank Commander Sergeant Joe Williams of the Sherwood Rangers describes his D-Day experience. The screen was taking on water faster than our pumps could handle. We had maybe 5 minutes before she went down, but I could see the beach, and I could see our boys getting cut up by that machine gun nest. So I dropped the screen early, took on more water, and drove that tank onto the beach with the bilge pumps screaming and water up to my knees. Somehow, we made it. Even more bizarre were Hobart's Funnies, the collection of specialized armor named after Major General Percy Hobart, whose imagination produced tanks that defied conventional military thinking. These weren't normal tanks adapted for special purposes. They were mechanical solutions to problems that had never existed before in military history. The AVRE, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, TIEs, carried a 40-pound spigot mortar designed to blast through concrete fortifications. But its most important equipment was a 40-foot bundle of wood called a fascine, carried on the tank's front like a massive rolled carpet. When encountering craters or anti-tank ditches, the AVRE would drop its fascine to create an instant bridge capable of supporting other vehicles. The crab flail tank carried rotating chains that beat the ground ahead of the vehicle, detonating mines through mechanical violence rather than explosive charges. The chains, spinning at 140 revolutions per minute, could clear a path 10 feet wide through the most densely planted minefields. The noise was tremendous, like a giant typewriter operated by a madman. But the system worked when nothing else could. Most spectacular was the Crocodile flamethrower tank, which could project burning fuel over 150 yards through a trailer-mounted system. German soldiers, veterans of the Russian front and North Africa, described the Crocodile as the most terrifying weapon they encountered, not because it was the most deadly, artillery killed more efficiently, but because it represented warfare beyond human comprehension. British crews called these vehicles Hobart's horrible contraptions, but they saved thousands of lives through sheer mechanical audacity. At Sword Beach, fascine-carrying AVREs filled 17 anti-tank ditches in the first hour, allowing conventional armour to advance inland. At Gold Beach, crab flail tanks cleared paths through minefields that would have taken engineers days to neutralize manually. But perhaps the most successful Hobart funny was also the simplest, the bobbin tank, which carried a canvas roadway that unrolled behind it like a mechanical carpet. On beaches where vehicles bogged down in soft sand, the bobbin created instant roads that allowed follow-up forces to advance without delay. The concept was so basic it seemed foolish, until you watched tanks and trucks racing across sand that had stopped entire divisions. Yet for every technological success, D-Day featured failures that revealed the razor's edge between innovation and disaster. The most tragic involved the rocket-equipped landing craft that were supposed to saturate German defenses with overwhelming firepower. Each LCTR, landing craft tank, rocket, carried 1,080 rockets designed to blanket German positions with high explosives. The theory was sound: approach the beach at high speed, fire all rockets in 30 seconds, then withdraw before German artillery could respond. The reality proved catastrophic. The rockets, fired from unstable platforms in rough seas, scattered across hundreds of yards instead of concentrating on targets. Many fell among Allied troops already ashore. Others exploded prematurely, setting their launching craft ablaze. LCT-R 544 suffered the most spectacular failure when a rocket misfired inside its launching tube, detonating the entire ammunition load. The explosion vaporized the craft and killed everyone aboard in a fireball visible from 10 miles away. Other crews, watching their sister ship disintegrate, continued their rocket barrages despite knowing their own weapons could kill them at any moment. The most creative deception technology involved the Ruperts, dummy paratroopers dropped by the hundreds to confuse German reserves about Allied objectives. Each Rupert consisted of a canvas body stuffed with straw, dressed in realistic uniform, and equipped with firecrackers to simulate gunfire. When dropped from aircraft, they looked convincingly human to observers on the ground. Operation Titanic involved dropping 400 Ruperts northeast of Caen, complete with recorded sounds of battle broadcast from hidden speakers. German units spent precious hours hunting cloth soldiers while real paratroopers seized actual objectives 50 miles away. The deception worked so well that some German commanders filed reports claiming they had repelled major airborne assaults that existed only in Allied imagination. But the real miracle of D-Day technology wasn't any single innovation, Tenier. It was the speed with which desperate improvisation became operational reality. The Mulberry Harbours went from concept to deployment in 18 months. The DD tanks required only 8 months from first prototype to channel crossing. Hobart's funnies emerged from drawing board to battlefield in timelines that peacetime bureaucracy would have considered impossible. This compression of innovation reflected something deeper than military necessity. It revealed what free societies could accomplish when existence itself was threatened. Engineers worked around the clock not because they were ordered to, but because they understood the stakes. Welders and mechanics pushed themselves beyond exhaustion because they knew their work could determine whether democracy survived. Test pilots flew experimental aircraft because they trusted that their sacrifice might save millions of others. The pressure cooker development of D-Day innovations also produced unexpected advances that changed civilian life for generations. Radar improvements designed for invasion coordination led directly to modern air traffic control systems. Logistics planning for feeding 3 million soldiers created supply chain management techniques still used today. Even the breakfast cereal in your kitchen traces its ancestry to K-rations developed for assault troops. Most importantly, D-Day technology proved that impossible deadlines could produce possible solutions when creative minds faced existential threats. The floating harbors shouldn't have worked, but they handled 400,000 tons of supplies in their first month. The swimming tanks shouldn't have survived, but enough reached shore to provide crucial fire support. The specialized armor shouldn't have been effective, but it solved problems that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Standing on Normandy beaches today, visitors see monuments to the soldiers who fought there, but they're also standing on monuments to human ingenuity, creative problem-solving, and the willingness to attempt the impossible when failure means the end of everything worth preserving. The machines of D-Day remind us that technology alone never determines victory, but when combined with courage, creativity, and absolute determination, mechanical miracles can tip the balance between freedom and slavery, between democracy and tyranny, between a world where innovation serves humanity and one where it serves only power. These desperate innovations, tested days before use and held together by prayer and precision engineering, made the impossible possible. They remind us that when free people face existential threats, they can create solutions that authoritarian systems cannot imagine, because freedom itself is the greatest innovation of all. D-Day's success rippled through time in ways its planners never imagined, reshaping not just the war's outcome, but the very nature of how nations cooperate, how militaries operate, and how free societies defend themselves. What began as a desperate gamble to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe became the template for everything from the Marshall Plan to the modern Internet. Within months of the Normandy landings, Allied commanders realized they had accidentally invented something revolutionary: truly integrated warfare. For the first time in military history, air, land, sea, and intelligence forces operated as a single coordinated system rather than separate services pursuing independent objectives. This wasn't planned. It emerged from necessity when traditional command structures proved inadequate for managing operations of unprecedented complexity. The integration went far beyond simple coordination. Allied naval gunfire supported infantry advances based on real-time intelligence from aerial reconnaissance, which in turn directed close air support missions that cleared the way for armored advances. Each element depended on every other element in ways that required constant communication, flexible planning, and decision-making authority distributed far down the chain of command. This model of combined operations revolutionized military thinking worldwide. Desert Storm in 1991 followed D-Day's template of overwhelming air superiority, precision intelligence, and coordinated ground assault. Modern counter-terrorism operations use the same principles of intelligence-driven, multi-service cooperation that Eisenhower's staff developed in smoky tents across southern England. But D-Day's most profound military legacy lies in proving that democratic armies possess inherent advantages over authoritarian forces. When plans collapsed, as they did across Normandy, Allied soldiers could think independently, adapt to circumstances, and take initiative without waiting for orders. A sergeant from Kansas could make battlefield decisions that a German colonel couldn't, because democratic training emphasizes individual responsibility, while authoritarian systems demand blind obedience. This flexibility under fire remains democracy's military edge 8 decades later. American soldiers in Afghanistan, British forces in the Falklands, coalition troops in Iraq, MRA, all demonstrated the same adaptive thinking that turned D-Day's chaos into victory. Free societies produce soldiers who can function when communication breaks down, when plans prove wrong, when success depends on individual courage and creativity rather than perfect execution of orders. The political consequences of D-Day's success proved even more transformative than its military innovations. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe with $13 billion of American aid, grew directly from lessons learned about securing the peace rather than just winning the war. Allied planners recognized that military victory meant nothing without economic recovery, democratic reconstruction, and long-term cooperation between former enemies. Here's what's remarkable about the Marshall Plan's connection to D-Day. Both operations required unprecedented international cooperation based on shared values rather than simple alliance convenience. The same trust networks that allowed British intelligence to work with French resistance, American logistics to coordinate with Canadian forces, and Polish paratroopers to serve under British command became the foundation for post-war reconstruction. General George Marshall, the plan's architect, explicitly cited D-Day's success as proof that democratic nations could cooperate effectively on massive scales. If Americans and British could coordinate the invasion of Europe, they could coordinate its reconstruction. If free peoples could unite against tyranny, they could unite for prosperity. The Marshall Plan became D-Day for economics, ATA, a coordinated assault on poverty and instability, using the same principles of shared responsibility and mutual trust. The technological innovations forced by D-Day's impossible deadlines created entire industries that define modern life. Radar improvements designed for invasion coordination led directly to civilian air traffic control systems. The same technology that guided Allied bombers to their targets now guides commercial airliners to safe landings at airports worldwide. Supply chain management, the invisible system that delivers everything from smartphones to groceries, traces its ancestry to Allied logistics planning for Operation Overlord. Feeding 3 million soldiers required coordination between American farms, British ports, and French distribution networks, with precision that had never been attempted. The mathematical models developed for calculating ammunition requirements and fuel consumption became the foundation for modern inventory management and just-in-time delivery systems. Even more profound was D-Day's influence on information technology. The communication networks that connected London to Washington to Moscow, allowing real-time coordination across continents, became prototypes for systems that eventually evolved into the Internet. The same principles of redundant connections, packet switching, and distributed decision-making that kept Allied forces coordinated during the invasion now keep the global digital economy functioning. But perhaps D-Day's most important legacy lies in what didn't happen. Without the invasion's success, we would inhabit a radically different world, IMNS, one where the Soviet Union alone liberated Western Europe, where Nazi Germany negotiated a separate peace with Stalin, where nuclear weapons were first used not to end a war but to continue one. The special relationship between America and Britain, forged in the planning rooms and on the beaches of Normandy, became the cornerstone of the post-war democratic alliance. NATO, the United Nations, the European Union, all trace their institutional DNA to the Allied command structure that Eisenhower built to coordinate the invasion. These weren't inevitable developments. They emerged from the specific experience of democratic nations learning to trust each other with their survival. Consider the alternative timeline we explored earlier, where D-Day failed and Europe divided between Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence. In that world, there would be no NATO to deter aggression, no European Union to promote cooperation, no democratic alliance to counter authoritarian expansion. The Cold War would have been fought between fascist and communist blocs, with democracy reduced to an isolated enclave in North America and the British Isles. Instead, D-Day's success created the conditions for democracy's global expansion. The principles tested on Norman beaches, that free peoples could cooperate effectively, that individual initiative could overcome systematic oppression, that international coordination could achieve impossible objectives, MIRA, became the foundation for the liberal international order that has prevented another world war for 8 decades. This isn't to suggest that the post-war world has been peaceful or perfect. Regional conflicts, proxy wars, and humanitarian disasters have marked every decade since 1944. But the absence of global conflict between major powers, the expansion of democratic governance, and the unprecedented prosperity experienced by developed nations all flow from decisions made in Allied planning sessions and executed on French beaches. The economic implications of D-Day's success continue reverberating through global markets. The Bretton Woods system, which established the dollar as the world's reserve currency, depended on America's emergence as the dominant Western power. a position secured by successful invasion of Europe. Modern global trade, international banking, and economic cooperation all rest on foundations laid when Allied forces proved that democratic nations could coordinate effectively on unprecedented scales. Educational systems worldwide still teach the lessons of D-Day cooperation. Business schools analyze Allied logistics as case studies in complex project management. Military academies study Eisenhower's leadership style as the gold standard for coalition command. Diplomatic training programs examine Allied negotiations as examples of how nations with different interests can achieve common objectives. But D-Day's most subtle influence operates through cultural memory and collective identity. For Americans, the invasion represents the moment when their nation assumed global leadership and proved worthy of it. For British, it marks the successful conclusion of their finest hour and the beginning of partnership with their former colony. For French, it symbolizes liberation and the restoration of national dignity. For Germans, it represents the beginning of reconciliation and reintegration into the community of democratic nations. These cultural memories shape political decisions in ways that rarely surface in diplomatic analysis. American willingness to maintain overseas commitments, British confidence in special relationships, French insistence on national sovereignty, German commitment to European integration, MSC, all reflect lessons learned from the success or failure of cooperation during the war's climactic campaign. Standing on Omaha Beach today, you can see the ghosts of alternative futures that died there. Without the invasion's success, there would be no European vacation destinations for American tourists, no study abroad programs for British students, no NATO exercises featuring German and French forces serving together. The simple act of free travel across borders that once marked the edge of civilization represents a victory as complete as any achieved by tanks and aircraft. The ripples continue spreading. Modern humanitarian interventions follow D-Day's model of multilateral cooperation for moral purposes. International development programs use logistics systems pioneered for Allied supply operations. Even space exploration reflects principles of international scientific cooperation first tested when American engineers worked with British radar specialists to coordinate the most complex military operation in history. Perhaps most importantly, D-Day proved that free societies possess hidden reserves of strength that authoritarian systems cannot match. When existence itself was threatened, democratic nations mobilized resources, creativity, and determination that their enemies never suspected existed. This lesson resonates every time democratic alliances face authoritarian challenges, from the Berlin airlift to the current defense of Ukraine. The invasion's success created a world where such cooperation became normal rather than exceptional, where international coordination was expected rather than miraculous, where democratic values could spread because they had been proven effective under the ultimate test of war. The echoes of D-Day continue reverberating every time free peoples choose cooperation over isolation, every time democratic nations respond to threats together rather than alone, every time the impossible becomes possible because ordinary people do extraordinary things. Today's free world exists because 18,000 paratroopers jumped into darkness, because 57,000 soldiers hit the beaches, because weather broke for 36 hours over the English Channel, and because one general said, "Okay, we'll go." The echoes of that decision will continue shaping human history for as long as people value freedom over tyranny, cooperation over conquest, and hope over fear. What does D-Day teach us 8 decades later, in a world transformed beyond recognition from the one that trembled under Hitler's shadow? The lessons written in Norman sand and Allied blood remain startlingly relevant to our current challenges, offering wisdom for how democratic societies can respond when their fundamental values face existential threats. Start with the fog of war, IF, the military principle that plans never survive contact with reality. Despite 3 years of meticulous planning, everything went wrong on D-Day. Paratroopers scattered across 60 miles instead of concentrating on objectives. Naval bombardment missed its targets. Landing craft drifted off course. Communications failed. Weather threatened the entire operation. Yet flexibility and individual initiative transformed chaos into victory. Modern military doctrine, from Desert Storm to current operations in Eastern Europe, still follows Eisenhower's fundamental principle: plan thoroughly, then adapt instantly. American forces in Iraq, NATO troops in Afghanistan, coalition operations in Libya, NAI, all demonstrated the same: adaptive thinking that turned D-Day's breakdown into breakthrough. The lesson transcends military applications. Any complex operation in an uncertain environment requires both detailed preparation and the flexibility to abandon those details when reality demands change. This principle applies equally to business strategy, disaster response, and technological innovation. Companies that thrive during market disruptions, emergency services that function during natural disasters, and research teams that achieve scientific breakthroughs all exhibit the same characteristics that made D-Day successful: thorough preparation, combined with willingness to improvise when conditions change. The deception operations that preceded D-Day rewrote the rules of information warfare in ways that echo through every modern conflict. When Juan Pujol Garcia convinced German high command that an entire army group was massing near Dover, he pioneered techniques now used in cyber operations, social media manipulation, and digital disinformation campaigns. Today's information warriors, whether defending against foreign interference or conducting their own influence operations, follow Garcia's playbook of creating believable fiction supported by verifiable details. The false radio traffic that convinced Germans to hold 19 divisions at Pas-de-Calais evolved into the digital signatures that modern militaries use to create phantom units and misleading electronic footprints. But Garcia's success also reveals the vulnerability of all information systems to skilled deception. If German intelligence, MSI, one of history's most professional services, could be completely fooled by a Spanish chicken farmer with imagination and determination, how confident should we be in our own ability to distinguish truth from deception in an age when artificial intelligence can create convincing fake videos and social media algorithms amplify false information? The Shadow War's lessons extend beyond military applications into every arena where truth competes with deception. Politicians who spread misinformation, corporations that manipulate public opinion, and foreign governments that interfere in democratic elections all employ techniques first developed in the secret war preceding D-Day. Understanding how Garcia operated provides crucial insight into how modern deception campaigns function and how they can be countered. Perhaps most sobering is D-Day's demonstration of how close catastrophic failure can come to spectacular success. The invasion succeeded despite weather that grounded half the air support, currents that carried landing craft miles off course, and German defenses that were stronger than intelligence had predicted. Change any single variable. Make Heinrich Severlow's ammunition last longer. Place Erwin Rommel at his headquarters instead of Germany. Delay Eisenhower's weather window by 48 hours, and the outcome could have been completely different. This knife-edge balance between success and failure appears throughout history more often than we care to admit. The Cuban Missile Crisis balanced on individual decisions made by Soviet submarine commanders. The fall of the Berlin Wall depended on confused communications between East German officials. The outcome of close elections often hinges on weather patterns that affect voter turnout. D-Day reminds us that history pivots on contingencies that seem minor until we examine their consequences. This recognition should inject both humility and urgency into how we approach current challenges. Climate change, nuclear proliferation, cyber warfare, and democratic backsliding all represent threats where small changes in timing, leadership, or technology could produce vastly different outcomes. The margin between success and catastrophe may be narrower than we assume, making decisive action more important than perfect planning. But D-Day's most profound lesson concerns the inherent advantages of democratic societies when facing authoritarian challenges. Allied victory resulted not from superior resources. Germany and Japan controlled more territory and population than the Allies until 1943, but from the flexibility that democratic training produces in individuals at every level of organization. When Allied plans collapsed, sergeants could make decisions that German colonels couldn't because democratic military culture emphasizes individual responsibility, while authoritarian systems demand blind obedience. This advantage appeared at every level, from individual soldiers adapting to unexpected circumstances to Allied high command adjusting strategy based on battlefield results rather than ideological requirements. The same advantage operates in non-military contexts. Democratic societies out-innovate authoritarian ones because scientists can challenge established theories. Entrepreneurs can disrupt existing industries, and citizens can criticize government policies without facing persecution. The messy inefficiency of democratic decision-making produces better long-term results than the apparent efficiency of authoritarian control. This lesson becomes crucial as democratic nations face renewed authoritarian challenges from powers that seem more efficient, more decisive, and more unified than democratic alliances. The temptation to respond by adopting authoritarian methods, restricting information, centralizing decision-making, demanding unquestioning loyalty, CMMA, would eliminate the very advantages that make democratic societies worth defending. D-Day also reveals the power of international cooperation when free nations face common threats. The invasion succeeded because Americans and British learned to coordinate despite different traditions, because French resistance fighters trusted Allied commanders they had never met, because Polish paratroopers served under British command for causes larger than national interests. This cooperation wasn't easy or natural. British generals resented American inexperience. American officers questioned British competence. French resistance cells distrusted Allied commitment. Polish commanders felt betrayed by previous Allied failures. Yet they worked together because they understood that individual survival depended on collective success. Modern challenges, from climate change to pandemic response to economic instability, require the same kind of international cooperation that made D-Day possible. Nations must coordinate policies despite different political systems, share resources despite competing interests, and trust partners despite historical grievances. The alternative is facing global threats with inadequate responses because cooperation seems too difficult or sovereignty too precious to compromise. The technological lessons of D-Day remain equally relevant in an age of rapid innovation. The invasion succeeded because engineers solved impossible problems under impossible deadlines, creating floating harbors and swimming tanks through creativity born of desperation. When existence was threatened, free societies mobilized intellectual resources that authoritarian systems couldn't match. Today's technological challenges, developing clean energy, creating artificial intelligence systems that serve humanity rather than replacing it, ensuring cybersecurity in an interconnected world, require the same combination of technical innovation and social cooperation that produced D-Day's mechanical miracles. The pressure cooker development of invasion technologies proves that free societies can innovate rapidly when they understand the stakes. Standing on Normandy beaches today, visitors encounter monuments to courage and sacrifice that seem almost mythical in their heroism. But D-Day's real lesson isn't that past generations were more heroic than current ones, it's that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they understand what they're fighting for, and trust that their sacrifice serves purposes larger than themselves. The 19-year-old paratroopers who jumped into darkness weren't professional soldiers, they were farm boys, and mechanics, and clerks who had trained for 2 years to fight for an ideal most had never clearly articulated. The engineers who built impossible technologies weren't superhuman geniuses. They were ordinary people working extraordinary hours because they knew their work could determine whether freedom survived. This capacity for extraordinary effort when facing existential threats remains democracy's greatest asset. Climate activists working to prevent environmental catastrophe, medical researchers developing treatments for incurable diseases, teachers preparing students for an uncertain future, all demonstrate the same willingness to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term survival that made D-Day possible. But D-Day also warns against romanticizing sacrifice or assuming that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. The invasion succeeded partly through luck, partly through German mistakes, and partly through individual courage that military doctrine cannot systematize or political speeches cannot inspire. Victory required both meticulous planning and willingness to abandon those plans, both international cooperation and individual initiative, both technological innovation and human courage. Most importantly, D-Day succeeded because enough people understood that some things are worth dying for, some principles are worth defending regardless of cost, and some threats require responses that transcend normal political calculations. This understanding cannot be manufactured through propaganda or mandated through legislation, SPME. It emerges from societies that actually embody the values they claim to defend. The lesson for our current challenges is both simple and demanding. Democracy survives when democratic citizens possess the knowledge, courage, and commitment to defend it against all threats, whether they come from foreign enemies or domestic corruption. Freedom isn't preserved by assuming it's permanent, it's protected by people who understand it's fragile and act accordingly. D-Day reminds us that the impossible becomes possible when free people unite against tyranny, when individual courage serves collective purposes, when democratic values prove stronger than authoritarian force. But it also reminds us that such victories require everything we have to give: our intelligence, our creativity, our cooperation, our courage, and sometimes our lives. The beaches of Normandy teach us that freedom isn't free, but they also prove that freedom is achievable when people who value it more than safety, comfort, or even life itself decide to pay the price that its preservation demands. That's why we remember D-Day, not as ancient history, but as continuing responsibility. Not as someone else's victory, but as our ongoing obligation to ensure that their sacrifice created a world worth inheriting and improving. The lessons written in sand and blood 8 decades ago remain fresh because the threats to human freedom remain constant. Only the names and methods change. The fundamental choice between courage and cowardice, between cooperation and selfishness, between hope and fear, that choice confronts every generation and demands the same answer D-Day provided: that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they understand that freedom's survival depends on their willingness to act,